All right, so this is extended response question of the exam. Question one. This one's worded a bit tricky, but it is doable, or at least once you see it, it makes a lot more sense. But here, Miss B invested $30,000 with part of its earnings, 5% interest, and the other part earning 8% interest. Now, that first part there, $30,000 is how much Miss B has, right? And in that $30,000, she has part of it at 5% interest, and the other part is 8% interest. So we don't know how much is going out of the 30,000. We don't know how much is going to be for 5%, and we don't know how much is then going to be for 8%, right? So what we're going to do is we give them a variable. So I call it X and Y. But when you call it X and Y, they're two different variables because they're two different amounts that you don't know how much you're investing for 5% and 8%. So the best way to do it is you make up a variable. So say she invested X amount of dollars for 5%. Then that means the leftover, how do you work out the leftover? If I spent, I don't know, $1,000 for 5% interest, well, then there's $29,000 left over here, right? If I spent, I don't know, $20,000, then clearly there's $10,000 left over here because they both have to add up to 30,000. True? So another way of thinking about it is I can model this by saying, well, if it's X dollars invested for 5%, well, then the 8% must be whatever the total is, 30,000, minus how much you invested for the 5%. And so 30,000 minus X will give you the leftover. True? So 30,000 minus 1,000 gives you 29,000. If I had 20,000 here, then 30,000 minus 20,000 gives you 10,000 that you're putting into 8% interest. Make sense? Okay, so now that I've modeled it, then we're saying 5% of this amount, so 5% of X is how much you're going to get in terms of interest for this component, right? Plus 8% interest, well, I'm doing 8% of 30,000 minus X. Whatever that is, that's got to be my total interest. True? For the year. So my total interest is the sum of those two parts. But they told us that the total interest from the investments was $2,100. So we know that in total, there'll be $2,100 from in terms of interest that came from the investments. So if we model this out and we write it out, well, 5% of X is the same thing as saying 0.05, because that's 5 divided by 100, 5%. Of means times, so 0.05X plus 8% of this, which really is just 0.08 of 30,000 minus X. Now, if you add those two together, whatever that interest is, so 5% of X and then plus 8% of 30,000 minus X, it should give you a total interest of 2,100. So if I wrote that out in one clear line, it's 0.05X, which is 5% of the amount that you put in for this interest to get that amount of interest, plus the 8%, which is 0.08 of the remaining amount. The remaining amount must be 30,000 minus X, and whatever that is, if I sum those total interests, it should give me a total of 2,100. Okay? And then from here, you can use a calculator because it is extended response questions. You can probably solve this. You can multiply it, expand it out. So I'll probably use a CAS. I'm just going to get my CAS up. And let's give it a moment. Maybe I'll pause the video for a second. All right, my calculator is loaded. Okay, here we go. So we want to solve, and you can just go to your calculator and do it all in one go. You can just go menu, algebra, so menu 3.1, which is solve. And you can actually just type it in 0.05 times X. Okay, make sure to put the times in. It's a good habit to put in. Back then, without putting the times, they don't know the difference between X and the other letters. So just make sure to put the times in. So X plus 0.08, 8% of, times 30,000 minus X. And the total should be 2,100, comma, X. Why did I do comma X? Because that just means solve for X. In that case, that gives me X is equal to $10,000 there. Or you could have done it the long way. You could have expanded each one and then solve it by hand manually. Let's see what they did. It looks like they just did that, and then they solved it on the CAD. So $10,000 for X, and so how much was investment? Well, if $10,000 was put into the 5%, well then the remaining amount must be $20,000 that was put into the 8%, and that finishes that question. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense there. But just think of it as how I've just displayed it: 30,000 split up into two components, and you got one that has two accounts. One has 5%, one has 8%.